In Genesis 27, Jacob deceives his father Isaac to steal the blessing of the firstborn brother Esau. The question is there something deeper happening in this story that we're missing? I believe the answer is yes. There are deeper revelations in this story, more than I ever knew. But if you want to catch these profound truths, you need to know a few things first. We're going to look at important contextual details for this story. We're going to note keywords and key ideas that you'll see in this chapter. We're going to look at some profound connections to previous stories in Genesis. And finally, we're going to ask some deeper questions that many people don't know to ask. So let's jump into the story of Jacob and Esau. Genesis 27, the story of how Isaac ends up blessing the wrong son. Quick summary of the story. I know some of you are familiar with the story. Jacob is the younger son, Esau is the older son. There are two sons in this story. Rebekah is the wife, Isaac is the father. Jacob and Rebekah, his mommy, they plan to deceive Isaac into blessing Jacob rather than Esau. Esau gets mad, wants to kill Jacob. Jacob runs away to his mother's homeland to find a wife. The story ends. Here are a few facts to know about the story that many believers aren't aware of or don't consider when they read this, and you need to be thinking about this. I'm sure you're wondering, why are you saying this all up front? Because I want you to learn how to study and read the Bible yourself. I just want to give you the tools to accelerate your study and help you go deeper into the scriptures. Fact number one, Jacob and Esau are no less than 70 years old when this whole event transpires. They're too old to be doing what they do here. Second thing is this story comes immediately after we're told in chapter 26 that Esau took two Hittite women for wives, and those two wives made life bitter for his mommy and his daddy. Okay. The third thing, Esau has already sold his birthright and showed contempt for it by choosing a bowl of stew that Jacob made for him. The fourth thing to note is that this story becomes the reason Jacob runs away to his mother's homeland to find a wife. Okay, he's fleeing for his life. And then the last interesting fact about the story you need to pay attention to as it relates to the context. When you read especially narrative, you want to know what story comes before this, what story comes after, and you also want to be aware of different components that seem reminiscent of other stories that have already happened. Okay, in the beginning of this story and at the end of it, meaning on both ends of this story, are clear statements about how Esau's two Hittite wives made life bitter for his mommy and daddy. On both ends of this story, beginning and end. So be paying attention to why that seems to be the capstone of both of this story. Some keywords to be paying attention to as you read the story for yourself and as we read. The word son, the word blessing, the word food, the word eat, and the word preparing, and every variation of those words. Some key ideas to pay attention to in this story. The concept or idea of coming near and approaching. The concept of preparing food. The idea of the firstborn son. The concept of blessing and curse. The idea of the nations. The concept of listening to the voice of another. We'll see Jacob do this. We'll see Esau do this. And then the idea of not recognizing or perceiving, specifically Isaac, because he's so old, he's very blind. Why are you so old? He's so old he doesn't recognize who Jacob is. Okay? So interesting facts about this story. Esau ends up being mad at Jacob. You would think for what he did, but the text says because of what Jacob had, which is reminiscent of the jealous older brother all throughout Scripture, like Joseph and his older brothers, Abel and Cain, David and his older brothers, Jesus and his brothers, and the people of Israel. Okay, and then you'll see that Rebekah in verse 46 of this story, right after Esau gets really mad, he's gonna try and kill Jacob. Jacob's mommy is gonna say, hey, run away to my homeland. I'll tell you when Esau calms down, and I'll tell you when it's safe to come back. But she never does. God is actually the one who does this later on. And then you'll see that Esau is loved by his father. These are just interesting facts. As we read the story, I know this might seem like an overload for you, but I really want to teach you how to study and how to read the scriptures and what to look for. In this story, you'll see that based on Genesis 25, 2 chapters earlier, we're told that Jacob loves his firstborn son Esau because Esau hunted and cooked him meals. Okay? So as we jump into this text, I also want you to be thinking of 2 different stories. And you can rewind this, you can play it slower. I just want to give you as much helpful information and tidbits to look for as you study the scripture yourself, because the story runs deep. This story actually connects us back to the fall of man in Genesis 3, and it connects us to the story of Cain and Abel. Here are when I read narrative in particular, I want to be looking for or recognizing repeating ideas that seem reminiscent of previous stories. And when I start to see components of other stories in my current story that I'm reading, it's going to help you a lot. So for instance, there's a connection to the fall of man in Genesis 3. And I'm going to list out 3, 6, 7 ideas that relate to the fall of man and this story in particular. You're going to see the idea of someone taking and eating food. And you go, that's not a big deal. Well, in Genesis 3, the fall of man is the result of not just Eve taking the forbidden fruit and eating, but giving to Adam to eat as well. She gives to Adam just as a meal is given here in this story. And it doesn't have the same repercussions or necessarily the same, element to it. But you also see death in this passage. Isaac is on the verge of dying. At least he thinks he is. He won't die for a while. And so he calls in Esau to bless him, just like death will be the result of Adam and Eve eating from the tree. I know this seems like a lot up front. The third thing to note about this story as it relates to Genesis 3 is that Jacob is going to listen to the voice of his mom, just as Adam is going to listen to the voice of his wife, and Eve listens to the voice of Satan in Genesis 3. Now, you might think this is a stretch, and there's no reason to make these connections. I highly disagree. You're going to see the blessing from the Father here in Genesis 27, the blessing of fruitfulness, multiplication, and ruling, the same blessing given to humanity in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. You're going to see the idea of curse that comes from disobedience and deception. The curse is throughout this passage, just like in Genesis 3, the curse comes upon humanity for disobedience and the deception of the serpent. You're going to see the element of deception, just like Satan deceived the woman. Jacob and Rebekah are going to deceive Isaac, and Esau also kind of ends up being deceived in the end. And then you'll see the idea of Jacob covering himself in Esau's garments that aren't his own, to cover up, to present himself as something he's not, whatever is going on there. And you'll see that tied to Adam and Eve sewing fig leaves, covering themselves, recognizing they're naked. And you're going to see that also as a connection. I can't help but notice those ideas are components of the fall narrative. And what's going on here, I'll explain why. And then the story actually connects to Cain and Abel. Right after the fall of man, Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel. Cain's jealous of Abel. They both bring an offering to God. So the 4 elements, I think, between this story and Cain and Abel is that you're going to see a hateful, angry, murderous older brother that wants to kill the younger brother, and he plans his murder. Cain kills Abel. Esau wants to kill Jacob here. You're going to see the favored brother, the favored younger brother, who has the blessing of his father based on what he brings the father. Abel brings an offering to God. Well, Jacob here is going to bring a meal to his father. And then you're going to see the concept of the favored brother, like the prodigal son, Abel, Joseph, David, Jesus. And then the idea of 2 brothers bringing a meal or an offering to the one who can extend favor and blessing to them or not. That's going to be reminiscent of God receiving an offering from Cain and Abel and regarding one over the other. Okay, so now we jump into the passage. I know that was a lot up front. I would encourage you to take notes. I plan to make this in written form, make these available for download. But for now, I just want you to notice those things. This is reminiscent of Genesis 3 in the fall, Cain and Abel, and there's a lot of surrounding narrative elements that you need to pay attention to. Now, as we go through the story, I'm going to ask questions about the text. Okay, when Isaac was old and his eyes were dim so that he could not see, he called Esau, his older son, and said to him, "My son." And he answered, "Here I am." First question is this, and I want you to think through these things, meditate on these things, look for answers throughout the scriptures. Maybe you'll never find an answer this side of heaven, maybe you will. But why is it important to note at the beginning of this story that Isaac is blind? Why does the story open with Isaac's blindness and his age? There you go, because that's the reason he's calling Esau in to be blessed. Well, think about this. How does Isaac's blindness connect to what was said in the last verse about Esau's 2 Hittite wives making life bitter for Isaac and his wife? What's the connection there? I think there is a connection. He said, "Behold, I am old," Isaac says. "I don't know the day of my death." Emphasis on him approaching death. "Now then, take your weapons, your quiver, and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me, and prepare for me." The emphasis is on what Isaac gets here. "Delicious food, such as I love, and bring it to me so that I may eat, that my soul that my soul may bless you before I die. Question: why does Esau need to bring a meal to his father in order to receive his father's blessing? Why does Isaac require Esau to bring him a meal in order for him to bless Esau? Something to think about. Now, Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to his son Esau. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game and bring it, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, I heard your father speak to your brother Esau. Bring me game and prepare for me delicious food that I may eat it and bless you before the Lord, before I die. Now, therefore, my son, here is what Rebekah, I always mix them up, does, based on what she heard Isaac tell Esau. My son, obey my voice as I command you. Go to the flock and bring me 2 good young goats so that I may prepare from them delicious food for your father, such as he loves. And you shall bring it to your father to eat so that he may bless you before he dies. In other words, Rebekah wants Jacob to receive the blessing, not Esau. I have 3 questions about this little section. Question 1, was this the way that God intended to exalt Jacob to the status of firstborn? Because God gave Rebekah a promise when both these kids were in her belly. God said the older will serve the younger. So, is this the way God intended for this to happen? And if not, what would have happened? Not that we can know for sure, but just to think through these things. What likely would have happened if Rebekah just let things run their course? Second question. By Esau taking 2 Hittite women as his wives, does he disqualify himself from the blessing and the birthright by marrying them? Would he just have been disqualified by his own actions if Rebekah and Jacob left this whole situation alone? And this is what I do when I read the Bible. I think through these things because I believe by asking questions, we go into deeper truth. We find the deeper things at the bottom of these stories. Question 3 about this section. Are we supposed to view Rebekah's actions as taking God's promise into her own hands like Abraham and Sarah did with Hagar? Or are we supposed to view this as faithful obedience to God's promise and his word? Is she in the right or is she getting in the way? Something to think about. But Jacob said to Rebekah, his mother, behold, my brother Esau is a hairy man. Why is that important? And I am a smooth man. Why the difference in their skin or their hairiness? Perhaps my father will feel me and I shall seem to be mocking him. So that's why. That's why that's important to the text. And I'll bring a curse upon myself and not a blessing. And his mother said, let your curse be on me. My son, only obey my voice. Second time she says, obey my voice. And go bring them to me. So when I notice repeating ideas or words or phrases in a passage, I just want to take note of that. And I also want to think about, as my kids scream in the background, is this reminiscent of any stories I've previously heard up to this point? Are these components of previous stories? And am I supposed to see a connection here? So verse 13, the question is, was Jacob supposed to listen to his mom here? Or was this a test from God that he actually failed? So he went and took them and brought them to his mother, and his mother prepared delicious food, such as his father loved. Emphasis on the father loving a kind of meal that he's used to having from Esau. Then Rebekah took the best garments of Esau, her older son, which were with her in the house, and put them on Jacob, her younger son. 2 things I notice in this little verse that I just want to ask a question about. In verse 15, why is the text describing Esau as the older son and Jacob as the younger son just right here? We already know Jacob's the younger. We already know Esau's the older. That seems unnecessarily repetitive. Why is this odd detail here about both sons? Something to think about. How does that relate to what's happening at this moment in the story? This is what we do when we study. And the skins of the young goats she put on his hands and on the smooth part of his neck. So question I have, why the hands and the neck? Maybe the rest of the text will answer that. And she put the delicious food and the bread which she had prepared into the hands of her son Jacob. Maybe that's starting to help me answer that. Verse 16 shows us the goat provided the meal for the father, as well as the covering for Jacob to disguise himself as Esau. So the question I have, I'm already going to the idea of a sacrifice and a covering. Are we supposed to see the dual nature of a sacrifice in this? As a goat is taken, the goat provides food for a meal and covering for Jacob to disguise himself. Are we supposed to see the dual nature of a sacrifice, being that a sacrifice is both an offertory meal and a covering of sorts? Just as Jesus offers himself, or we see offerings in Levitical priesthood and the law that actually acts as a temporary covering, or based on wherever we're at in history, a covering for people. Just like God covers his people, just something I'm thinking about. So he went into his father and said, "My father," and he said, "Here I am." "Who are you, my son?" Remember how I said pay attention to the idea of the father not knowing who Jacob is, lack of perception, blindness. Jacob said, "I'm Esau, your firstborn. I've done as you've told me. Now sit up and eat of my game. I hunted, I did what you told me, so that your soul may bless me." Emphasis on Isaac blessing because of the meal Jacob brought. Second time. But Isaac said to his son, "How is it that you found it so quickly, my son?" He's getting suspicious. He answered, "Because the Lord your God granted me success." He pulls the God card. Then Isaac said to Jacob, "Please come near, that I may feel you, my son, to know whether you're really my son Esau or not." So Jacob went near to Isaac, his father, who felt him, remember the whole neck and hands, and said, "The voice is Jacob's voice." And there's 70 up to this point. You would expect the father to recognize him a little better than he does, but the hands are the hands of Esau. And he didn't recognize him. The third time we see he doesn't recognize him because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's hands. So he blessed him. I have a question. Why is the blessing based on the hairiness of the individual? Why does that definitively determine for Isaac that this is actually Esau? Of course he's hairy, but aren't there other ways you can recognize him? He said, "Are you really my son Esau?" How many times does he have to ask? He answered, "I am." And he said, "Bring it near to me, that I may eat of my son's game and bless you." How many times does the story want to tell us that Isaac is blessing in response to the meal the son brings? So I think verse 25, and this is just me thinking out loud, I think verse 25 seems reminiscent of a sacrificial priestly meal. And the question I have is, are we supposed to view it like this? Not to make Isaac out to be God, but just a question. So he brought it near to him, he ate, and he brought him wine, and he drank. Then his father Isaac said to him, "Come near and kiss me, my son." So he came near and kissed him, and Isaac smelt the smell of his garments and blessed him. Now I thought, so far, he's already blessed Jacob at least once. So he blessed him because his hands were hairy. So what is this? Is this like a level 2 blessing? Is this the completion of the blessing? And a question I have about this verse in particular is, why does the blessing result from Isaac smelling the garments of Esau? And is this supposed to be reminiscent of how God regards the pleasing, fragrant aroma of his son's sacrifice? Not to make Esau or Jacob a sacrificial atonement in any way, but just the idea of a father being pleased with the smell of his son. "See, the smell of my son is as the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed." Now, us in Western culture, this goes right past us, but he loves the field, man. And Isaac goes, "May God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine. And let peoples serve you, and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you." Question. On verse 29. This is the blessing that God gave to Abraham in chapter 12, verse 3. Same exact wording, but the statement about the nations is different. God mentions to Abraham in chapter 12 that his offspring would be a blessing to the nations. But Isaac here seems to talk differently about the nations. Let the nations bow down. Let the nations serve you, son. Are we supposed to see Isaac's version of the blessing as being different from God's blessing originally given to Abraham in chapter 12? Something to think about. And if so, what should we conclude based off that? Is there a difference between blessings in the hands of man or in the mouth of man versus God's? As soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, when Jacob had scarcely gone out from the presence of Isaac his father, Esau, his brother, came in from his hunting. He also prepared delicious food and brought it to his father, and he said to his father, "Let my father arise and eat of his son's game, that you may bless me." His father Isaac said, "Who are you?" He answered, "I'm your son, your firstborn, Esau." Then Isaac trembled very violently, some aggressive language, and said, "Who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me? And I ate it all before you came, and I blessed him? Yes, and he shall be blessed." As soon as Esau heard the words of his father, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry, and said to his father, "Oh, bless me, even me also, O my father." Question about verse 34. Esau's cry of distress is described as being bitter. The narrative opens essentially by saying Esau's 2 Hittite women, his wives, made life bitter for his father and his mother. Are we supposed to see a connection there? Just between the usage of the idea of bitterness, the word bitterness. But he said, "Your brother came deceitfully, Esau. He's taken away your blessing." Question about this verse. Jacob seems to be playing the role of the serpent in Genesis 3. There you go, that's a stretch. Actually, no. The serpent deceived the woman, right, into essentially, and Adam, that's the main point. The serpent deceived the woman and Adam into forfeiting their right, their rule, their dominion in the earth. And here, Jacob deceives Isaac into giving him what technically Esau as the firstborn deserved, but God said I'd give it to the younger anyway. The point is that Jacob is deceiving the way the serpent did. And the question becomes, God still honors the blessing that Isaac extended to Jacob, that Jacob attained through deception. The question becomes why? Why does God honor Isaac's blessing of a son that deceived his way into it? Verse 36, Esau said, "Is he not rightly named Jacob, heel grabber? He's cheated me these 2 times. Jacob's a usurper, a deceiver. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he's taken away my blessing." Notice the emphasis on Jacob taking. Then he said, "Have you not reserved a blessing for me?" Remember I said there's a connection between this and Genesis 3, the woman reaching for and taking. Jacob here reaching and taking the birthright, the blessing. Isaac answered and said, "Esau, behold, I've made him lord over you. All his brothers I've given to him for servants, and with grain and wine I've sustained him. What can I do for you, my son?" 2 questions about this verse. Number 1, Isaac mentions brothers, plural. Is this speaking about all the descendants that will come from Jacob and Esau from both sides? Or are there different other brothers we're actually not told about in the narrative because they're not necessarily important to the story? Second point, question. Is Isaac overreaching his authority? Or do his words of blessing legitimately carry the power to shape the future of Jacob's life? Because it seems as though they do. Just a question I have. And I like asking questions. Esau said, "Have you but one blessing, my father? Bless me also, my father." And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. So I have a question about Esau crying and in distress about this. Previous stories make it clear that Esau doesn't really care about his birthright. So I have a question. Did Esau do this to himself by showing contempt for his birthright 2 chapters earlier? Or is this story unrelated and it was going to happen nonetheless? Meaning, is Esau losing his blessing connected to the fact that he showed contempt for his birthright? Or are those 2 ideas disconnected and just unrelated? Then Isaac his father answered and said, "Behold, away from the fatness of the earth shall your dwelling be, away from the dew of heaven on high." The last time we saw this kind of statement, at least the first time in Genesis, was with Cain. Cain is essentially exiled away from the abundance and plentifulness of the earth and even the presence of God. I have a question. Why is there no blessing for Esau here? He ends up being pretty rich in the end when Jacob finds him years from now. So this statement that Isaac makes about Esau, away from the fatness, away from the dew of heaven on high, does this statement from Isaac have no real influence on Esau's future? Because Esau ends up being very rich in the end. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you will break his yoke from your neck. Do you remember what Jacob covered himself with, where he covered himself to disguise himself as Esau? His neck and his hands. The only two places in this story the neck is emphasized. I just want to think, is there a connection between these two ideas? Possibly. What does it mean for Esau to break Jacob's yoke from off his neck? How does he practically do this? What does it mean to grow restless for Esau? And he finally reaches that point and goes, I'm going to break Jacob's yoke from off my neck. What does that mean? I'm just leaving you a bunch of questions to think through. Now, Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, so Esau, according to the text, is not mad because of what Jacob did, though that was a part of it. What Jacob did to lie and cheat and deceive was the way he gained the blessing. But Esau's not mad necessarily at what Jacob did to him. Esau's mad about what Jacob has, that he received from his father, that Esau does not have. And that is very reminiscent of the older, jealous brother theme throughout the scriptures. And he says, the day of mourning for my father are approaching. And I just want you to ask, why is Esau mad about what Jacob has, rather than about what Jacob did to him? The days of mourning for my father are approaching, my kids. Then I will kill my brother Jacob. He's planned, he's decided, I'm going to kill Jacob. But the words of Esau, her older son, were told to Rebekah. My question is, who told Rebekah, and who did Esau tell his plans to? So she sent and called Jacob, her younger son, and said, behold, your brother Esau comforts himself about you by planning to kill you. Like, that's how he's self-soothing. So I have a question again, who did Esau share this with? Now therefore, my son, obey my voice, emphasis on Jacob listening to the voice of his mother. Arise, flee to Laban, my brother, and Haran, and stay with him a while, until your brother's fury turns away, until your brother's anger turns away from you, and he forgets what you've done to him. Then I'll send and bring you from there. Something to think about is, Rebekah never calls and sends for Jacob to come back. God tells Jacob in a dream it's time to go home. And he doesn't even necessarily go home. He goes somewhere else. Verse 45, she says, until he forgets what you've done, and his anger is abated. I have a question. Does Esau forget what Jacob does when he meets Jacob next? Or does Esau forgive what Jacob's done to him when Jacob meets him next? Then I will send you from there. Why should I be bereft? Think of bereavement, losing someone. Should I be bereft of you both in one day? It seems as though Rebekah's saying, I don't want to lose both of you. So I have a question. What makes Rebekah think she's lost Esau? Does Rebekah think God would take Esau's life if Esau killed Jacob? Does Rebekah think that if Esau kills Jacob, that losing his life would be the punishment for that? Or does Rebekah see this as being bereaved of Esau today? This whole story of Jacob lying and deceiving and cheating and ascending the birth, the firstborn status, or receiving the blessing. Does Rebekah view this as being bereaved or bereft of Esau and losing Esau today? Then Rebekah said to Isaac, I hate my life because of the Hittite women that Esau married. If Jacob marries one of the Hittite women like these, one of the women of the land, what good will my life? I'd rather die. So I have a question. This whole plan Rebekah puts together to make Jacob receive the blessing. Did Rebekah plan this out of spite for Esau's wives? Or was this an attempt to fix the problem? Is this unrelated? Because on both ends of the story, if you go to the beginning of chapter 27, right before chapter 27 opens, we have a statement about Esau's wives, and here the story ends with that. And then chapter 28 opens. Isaac calls Jacob and blessed him and said, "You must not take a wife from the Canaanite women." Why is it so important? Last question. Why is it so important for Jacob not to marry a woman from the nations of that land, a Canaanite, like his brother Esau did? Why 3 times throughout this story does that seem to be a reoccurring idea, as if to be the motivation of this story or the focus of this story? Jacob's going to go find a wife from his mother's homeland. Esau settled for women. Then Esau's going to take a daughter of Ishmael as another wife. There's a lot of this intermarriage talk and intermarrying with the surrounding pagan nations of the land. How is that a part of this story overall? I hope these questions and this overall study has been helpful so that you would reconsider your understanding of the story and dive deeper into it. That's all I got for you today. I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough. Hey, I just want to thank you for all your support and prayers that make this ministry possible and help us to accomplish our mission. Your support makes it possible for us to create all the free resources we have available for anyone around the world. Our mission is to teach people how to read the Bible so they can live and teach the Bible themselves. So be sure to visit abovereproachministry.com for all these free resources and to support this ministry. And if you're a new believer, be sure to check out the new believer section on the homepage of our website and grab a copy of my book, Fruitful, while you're there. God bless you guys, and as always, keep moving towards Jesus.